This is Balance of Power coming from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studio. 1 year ago tomorrow, a mob attacked the U.S. Capitol to stop the counting of electoral votes in the presidential election. And in the aftermath, social media posts contributed a good deal to the investigation of who did what, because it turns out that social media played a material role in the day's events. To talk about that role and what has been done to change what happens the next time, we welcome now Adam Kovakovich. He is CEO of the Chamber of Progress, an industry trade group funded by technology companies such as Amazon, Uber, Meta, Google, and Twitter. So, Adam, thanks so much for being with us. First of all, let's start with the role of social media a year ago. What do we know about it?
Look, I think what we know is that about a year ago, and really even before that, in the election aftermath, that social media platforms were facing really just an unprecedented situation where you had, a U.S. leader essentially fomenting misinformation regarding the election and fomenting insurrection on their platforms. And this was something that the social media platforms had never dealt with before. And, I think we've seen that this was across all platforms. It was on social media. There was an analysis in the New York Times today saying that this had been happening on podcasts, too. So it's clear that our country has a misinformation problem. And in today's digital age, that misinformation is traveling faster than before. And I think all the platforms are looking to see what they can do to prevent the spread of that and prevent another crisis like we saw a year ago.
So what is different today for the platforms, and to what extent does it diverge, and to what extent does it sort of coalesce?
Well, I think what's different today is that, for a long time, all of the platforms were fairly differential, particularly to elected officials, in allowing them to use social media to spread their message. And in fact, services like Twitter had a public officials exemption, right, that gave public officials a little bit more leeway. And again, I don't think anybody imagined that you'd have a sitting U.S. president using their platforms to foment insurrection. But, of course, we then saw post-January 6th, Twitter, Facebook both ban President Trump. This has continued, by the way. I mean, just this last week, Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene saw her campaign accounts being turned off by both Twitter and Facebook. And so I do think that what you're seeing essentially is really unprecedented abuse. And you're seeing that the platforms have to make hard decisions about setting in place generally a series of penalties and strikes and systems that tell even political officials, we will turn off your account if you continue to abuse them and violate our terms of service.
When I think back a year or so ago, Adam, when President Trump first lost access to Twitter, there was a lot of speculation that it would be ineffectual because there would just be a workaround. He'd go to an alternative, and that social media platform would grow as a result. Has that happened?
Well, I think what you did see for a period of time, for example, he would release statements and then reporters would screenshot those statements or his staff would release them. Interestingly, a study released this week by the Atlantic Council showed that what happened was when mainstream social media sites like Twitter and Facebook started cracking down on misinformation, it actually ended up dispersing some of the more far-right extremist groups and individuals to alternative online spaces, to services like Getter and Gab and Parler. And so while some of the movements that were present on mainstream social media sites before have dispersed, right? They're still online, and we shouldn't be fooled. But they're maybe organizing on other sites with less restrictive content moderation policies.
So far, as I know, it's been the private sector who's acted on their own to self-police, if I can put it that way. Is there a role for the government, a constructive role for the government?
This is hard because the fact is, unfortunately, I think we've seen just the opposite, which is what I consider to be an unconstructive role by the government in the realm of speech. You saw many states, mostly Republican states, but 33 states since January 6th had proposed legislation that would actually punish social media platforms for taking down extreme content. Almost all of that legislation had been introduced by Republican lawmakers under the guise of this false idea that they were being censored by social media. Many of those have not stood up to constitutional scrutiny. In fact, proposals that became law in Florida and Texas were struck down by federal judges. But it does show, frankly, that there is a pretty large and powerful movement on the right that has legislative power and is willing to defend really the most odious speech And I think the encouraging thing is that the courts have affirmed the right of platforms to say, we don't want to be a haven for this kind of speech either.
This is the moment in the discussion when I go back to my recovering lawyer days and point out that the governments censor, private companies cannot censor. The First Amendment reads against governments. It doesn't read against private individuals. People get confused about that. Have those companies, though, paid a commercial price for it?
I don't think so. I actually think it's just the opposite. You're absolutely right. I think what in fact some politicians on the right have learned is that testing the boundaries of these services and then kind of getting banned or blocked is great for their reputations on the far right. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene knew exactly what she was doing in getting banned by Twitter, and increases her sense of martyrdom. But with respect to commercial implications, I think it's just the opposite. There was a survey done by Morning Consult a couple months ago, and it said that what most users actually want is for services like Twitter and Facebook to take more action against conspiracy theories, hoaxes, scams. There's a small portion of people who want to see that on social media, but they have plenty of services like Gab and Parler and Getter to go to get that. I think the people who run these services, Twitter and Facebook and others, directly see that, if people are not having, if most of their users are not having a positive experience on the social network, not going to keep coming back. And so they do have, I think, they recognize an imperative to take action against the most egregious content on their platforms.
So we've been talking about speech, particularly relating back to a year ago, less one day, and the attack on the Capitol. What about other issues that have been raised about tech? Are there other possibilities for private, again, I'll say self-policing on things like data protection and privacy?
Not just self-policing, but I think government action too. And in fact, our organization, Chamber of Progress, we are advocates for a sensible regulation, and particularly advocates for the federal government to finally pass a consumer online privacy bill that has been languishing for years, to take action on spam and malware and cybersecurity, all of those things. One of the things we've seen in surveys that we've done, most recently a survey of California voters, found that action on things like privacy and security is way more popular among the public than issues around speech per se, right? Because speech issues cut differently based on how people, largely partisanship. But there's a lot of consensus around things like privacy and data security. There was actually funding in the failed Build Back Better bill to significantly bolster the Federal Trade Commission's enforcement of privacy and security. Unfortunately, that faltered. But we're hopeful that we could finally see a federal privacy bill in this year, 2022.
One last quick one, if I could, Adam. What's the number one thing on your agenda for next?
I think it's honestly our biggest thing is really, how do you make sure that tech operates responsibly while also continuing to serve most consumers, right? I think everybody wants tech to really be serving people as opposed to tech, it's people serving tech.
Adam, great to have you with us. Adam Kovacevic of the Chamber of Progress. And that does it for Balance of Power for today. I'm David Weston, and this is Bloomberg.